think an overcast Friday is the perfect time to talk about Shakespeare, and I'm glad you agreed. Glad you came and joined us today. We're very happy to be presenting a Shakespeare at Noon program. My name is Amanda Gillen. I'm the director of the education department here at the Frick. We've been having a lot of fun with this exhibition, a lot of people popping in and out, coming back for different programs. This one today is actually very special. We have with us Dr. Sam Lemley, Curator of Special Collections from Carnegie Mellon University Libraries, and our own Dawn Brean, who is the Chief Curator and Director of Collections here at the Frick Pittsburgh. Sam and Dawn and a whole other team are the people behind the Shakespeare Folio exhibition. I know a couple of you haven't been back yet, but when we're done here, if you haven't seen it, or if you want to go again with a new lens of information, it's in the gallery. If you walk out and go to the left into the back right corner of the museum, it's lovely and definitely worth seeing again once you learn everything you're going to learn today. I will put in a shameless plug and say that I hope you stay for the rest of the day if you haven't been here all morning. We have some really cool, fun merchandise, bookmarks and all kinds of books and notebooks and things at our museum store. Our cafe is open. You can get a glass of sangria or have some lunch. And we also have our Great Migration exhibition open in the Car and Carriage Museum. It's a new exhibition that explores the migration of Black Southerners from the South to industrial cities like Pittsburgh, and there are some really cool loan vehicles up there. That is a paid exhibition, free for members. And then we have a new tour of Clayton, if you haven't been for a while. It's called Gilded is Not Golden, and it is looking at the year of 1892. Talks about the Frick family and the house, but also gets into issues of labor and immigration and what Pittsburgh was like in the late 19th century. So that's running for a long time. That's our new tour. And as always, all of that's free for members. Thank you to our members who are here today. Your support lets us bring exhibitions like this to the Frick. Two quick upcoming programs, and then I will turn it over to Sam. Next Friday, we're doing a talk in the galleries. It's free, 2 to 2:30. We do one Shakespeare gallery talk a month, and the topic next week is The Word is My Oyster, our everyday Shakespearean English. So that'll be a lot of fun. You can just come in and go to the gallery. And then in September, if you haven't heard, we are a venue for Shakespeare in the Park. They do Shakespeare around the city in the different parks every summer, and we are lucky enough to be a venue this year. So on September 22nd and 23rd, it's free. You can just come, bring a picnic, buy a picnic here, bring your blanket, 2 o'clock on the lawn by Clayton, and they are doing Antony and Cleopatra, and I believe it's an all-female cast. They always do a really edgy, cool production. So I encourage you to keep coming back for Shakespeare. It is with us a long time. With that, I'm going to introduce Sam Lemley, Curator of Special Collections at Carnegie Mellon. Thank you, Sam, for partnering with us, for being here, and for giving us your time today. I'm very, very thrilled to have you. Welcome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Amanda. And I'll just add, if you came to the exhibition earlier in the run, last week we turned the pages of some of the folios, so they're open to different openings. So it's a little bit different now, so go back and see that. And that'll happen, I think, quarterly, right? That's what we planned. All right. I am not a PowerPoint user. Is this right? This one?
I should have done that same also.
No, you're fine. It's fine. Good. That looks right. I can't read my script, though. It's dark.
There's a light on the podium, left corner. If you flip it, I'll come back.
Left corner. There it is. Okay. That'll be fine. Okay. Thank you all for being here. Did I say that already? So, let's see. It's a slide here. Oops. Get ahead of myself. So, Shakespeare is a well-known inventor of words. So much so that observation seems a little bit trite, right? His contribution to spoken English amounts to some 1,700 unique turns of phrase that were, as far as we can trace, first uttered by actors performing Shakespeare's plays. And these include words like jaded, gossip, dwindle, and eyeball, which is one of my favorite Shakespeare coinages. But this association between Shakespeare and vast quantities of text has actually found recent expression in Google's artificially intelligent chatbot, which they've named Bard. This is the website, screen capture of the website here. According to this website, Bard promises to supercharge your imagination, boost your productivity, and bring your ideas to life. This is not a claim that I've myself tested, but the fact that this computerized writing assistant shares a nickname with Shakespeare, the immortal bard, as he's known, underscores this link between Shakespeare and almost superhuman quantities of text, right? Almost as miraculous as an algorithm, Shakespeare used words and he used them often. Given this abundance of language, it might surprise us then to learn that the word folio, which is why we're all here, appears only once in all of Shakespeare's plays. In the final lines of the first act of Love's Labour's Lost, a comedy first performed in 1594, we find Don Adriano de Armada working himself up, trying to find the appropriate mood and mindset for poetic invention. Hoping to woo a girl named Jacquinetta, he invokes or commands the tools of his literary art. Devise wit, write pen, for I am for whole volumes in folio. So he's promising to fill large books, several folio volumes, with his poetry. But the reference is not a flattering one. Armado is an obnoxious braggart, enamored of his own stilted way of speaking, and so his oath to turn sonnet and fill folios with the strained invention of his wit is not one we hope he keeps, right? We're meant to groan at this point, right? Rather than applaud, and it's more than likely that Shakespeare's original audience did just that. The irony is that Love's Labour's Lost is a play obsessed with the idea of literary fame and legacy. The play's central male characters famously renounce the company of women to commit themselves to study and literary invention. Of course, the retreat into monastic studiousness is doomed to failure, and that failure is the occasion for Shakespeare's comedy. But the motive of these characters is clear. They want to be famous, to be remembered for the words they write. One of these characters observes that literary greatness can, quote, make us heirs of all eternity. So the irony is that this play about literary ambition puts folio, the word perhaps most closely tied to Shakespeare's own literary legacy, in the mouth of one of Shakespeare's most ridiculous fools. But why does the word folio matter so much for Shakespeare? To use its full title, Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies contains 36 of the 38 plays attributed to Shakespeare. When the book was published from the London print shop of Isaac Jaggard in November 1623, more or less 400 years ago, the folio represented the first successful attempt to gather Shakespeare's dramatic works in one printed volume. More than that, of the 36 plays that appear in the first folio, 18 had never been printed before. And remember that no complete handwritten versions of Shakespeare's plays survive. So the implication of that, of course, is that without the first folio, fully half of Shakespeare's plays would have been lost to history. And I list those plays here. So this list obviously includes some of Shakespeare's most important plays, crossing the genres of comedy, history, and tragedy. It's really no exaggeration to say that had these plays not survived, we would have inherited a significantly reduced and impoverished canon. So if this talk and the exhibition down the hall have a guiding theme, it's the idea that a book is a preservative technology, a kind of vessel that can carry cultural memory across long stretches of time. And the first folio, responsible for preserving 18 of Shakespeare's plays, is a wonderful example of the permanence that print provides. What I find fascinating, though, is that this idea attended the first folio from the beginning. From the outset, those involved in the folio's publication saw the project as a way of encoding Shakespeare for posterity. The folio's editors, actors John Hemming and Henry Condell, for instance, claim in their preface to have gathered Shakespeare's plays, quote, absolute in their numbers as Shakespeare conceived them. Hemming and Condell are even more direct elsewhere. They write, we have but collected them, and done an office to the dead, to procure his orphans' guardians, without ambition either of self-profit or fame, only to keep the memory of so worthy a friend and fellow alive as was our Shakespeare. And I always point out that I love the typographic flourish of putting Shakespeare's name in all caps. It's as if the book itself were a kind of monument or epitaph offered in Shakespeare's memory. But here, the editors are likening Shakespeare's plays to orphaned children. I think that's really interesting, to use an overused word. And in offering those orphan plays to a paying public in print, they're seeking guardians to protect them. Readers and patrons, in other words, might foster Shakespeare's literary legacy. This trope of comparing literary works to children is actually an old one. You see it everywhere in the Renaissance. And you don't have to work hard to understand the subtext, particularly in light of Heming and Condell's use of the language of conception and inheritance. Namely, the survival of these plays guarantees their reception by later generations of readers, performers, and theatergoers. Print, as I've suggested, makes this possible. But more than merely being printed, the folio is very intentionally designed for the purpose of preserving Shakespeare. And that objective started with the decision to print the plays in folio format. As Shakespeare scholar Francis Connor has observed, when the first folio was printed, folios represented completeness, cultural prominence, and literary immortality. And the first folio, as I've been hinting, kind of ticks all three of these boxes. The very size of the book and its presentation of Shakespeare on the title page, you have his name and then his face kind of gravely staring out, it communicates a certain prestige and a certain cultural prominence. I should pause here though and give a definition. When I share the folios with CMU students in the library's special collections, as I'm doing here, the second most common question I get after maybe how many copies survive or how much a copy is worth is, what's a folio? And I often point out that's a really fair question because it's this antiquated word that has just sort of accompanied Shakespeare across the last 400 centuries, and I think it's worthwhile to revisit what exactly it means. So strictly speaking, folio describes a book format, which more or less means the shape and size of a printed volume. Early printed books were made up of sheets of paper that were printed and then folded and stitched together and bound right into volumes. A folio is simply a book made up of sheets of paper folded once, making 2 leaves and 4 pages, usually of a large size. The first folio, if you want to get really technical, is known as a folio in 6s, and this is a diagram showing its structure on the left. So basically it's made up of a series of 3-sheet gatherings, with each gathering comprising 6 leaves, hence folio in 6s. And you can get a sense of the scale of the book in this photograph next to the diagram. That is the copy that is CMU's copies of the first folio, obviously closed. So it's not massive, but it's not exactly handheld either, right? And of course you'll be able to take a closer look at its size in the gallery. What's important to remember here though is that the folio format was usually reserved for books on serious subjects, things like theology or law, sometimes history. While folios of poetry had been issued before the first folio's publication, Shakespeare's was the very first to contain only plays. That's pretty remarkable if you think about it. And this is at a time when plays were considered kind of the lowest literary genre. So there's a conscious decision being made to project a kind of stateliness in the size and format of the book, and it's for that reason that the folio is so closely tied to Shakespeare's literary afterlife. As I've said, the folio is rightly credited with preserving Shakespeare. But that's only part of the story. While the first folio is often the subject of centenary celebrations and much cultural fanfare, 3 later editions are, I think, just as important in the study of Shakespeare's posthumous reputation and reception. And these are the so-called second folio, printed in 1632, the third folio, printed in 1663, and the fourth folio in 1685. So I've been telling people if I'm still here in 2085, maybe we'll have a 400th anniversary of the fourth. Let's see. So shown here are the title pages of some of the CMU copies of the later 3 folios, and we actually have 2 copies of each of the later folios, so 7 folios in all, which is really remarkable. Anyway, very exciting. And all 7 are actually on display in the gallery. No need for a literal tomb or stone monument because in writing the plays, he built one for himself. Right? What's most striking about this poem, though, is the identity of its author. It was written by John Milton, who would go on to write the biblical epic Paradise Lost in the aftermath of the English Civil War. And I suspect that many of us read something by Milton in the same undergraduate or high school English survey courses that first introduced us to Shakespeare. So they're both part of, the established Renaissance literary canon. Milton was only 24 years old when the second folio was published, making this poem the first piece of his writing to appear in print. And that might seem impressive, but there's some speculation that John Milton's father actually knew the printer. So, notwithstanding the literary merits of the poem, it might have been kind of a favor extended to the son of a friend. But what matters about this moment in the second folio is that it gives us a glimpse of a culture in formation. The second folio offers a kind of synopsis of English literary history as it then stood in the 17th century. Milton, who was only just beginning to entertain the possibility of a literary career for himself, here claims Shakespeare as his own. He says, my Shakespeare, right? What need my Shakespeare? But he also means our Shakespeare. The implied message here is that Shakespeare is uniquely English, right? Milton is sort of experimenting with a literary nationalism. The Italians might have Dante, or even Virgil, the Greeks have Homer, but we, right, the English have Shakespeare. And so you can see that in the short period of time, just less than a decade, that separated the first folio and the second folio, Shakespeare had begun to take on a mantle of literary greatness that he's retained really up to the present. Milton, meanwhile, sees Shakespeare's plays as a point of origin and a touchstone not only for his own literary ambitions, but for the literary ambitions of the English nation. The interest of the later folios doesn't end with the second, of course. The third folio exists in two distinct forms. One of these, dated 1663 on its title page, is an otherwise straightforward reprint of the second folio. The second form of the third folio, however, has a 1664 date on its title page and contains 7 plays that do not appear in either the first or second folios. And this second version, second issue, it's called, the third folio is shown here on screen. And you can see that, right on the title page, it lists these 7 plays. And it kind of entices potential buyers by saying, these have never before been printed in folio. So surviving copies of the third folio represent 2 distinct issues, each marked by the presence or absence of the 7 plays that the 1664 title page proclaims were never before printed in folio. The reason for the addition of these 7 plays is believed to have been commercial rather than literary, and that probably doesn't surprise us, right? The publishers of the third folio needed a way to differentiate it from the second and first folios, making it more saleable. In other words, the inclusion of these 7 plays was a bit of savvy marketing. And it was also a tacit acknowledgement that buyers could probably purchase a second-hand copy of the first or second folio at a significant discount. So the only problem here is that 6 of these 7 plays are not by Shakespeare. Only Pericles, which is the first play listed on the title page, is now accepted to be Shakespearean. In their effort to entice buyers to part with their cash for a more complete collection of Shakespeare's plays, the publishers of the third folio therefore significantly muddied the canon of Shakespeare. And while scholars have since sorted out which of these plays are authentic and which are apocryphal, the third folio marked a significant turning point in how Shakespeare was edited, published, and read. Right? Increasingly, after the appearance of the third folio, Shakespeare was under negotiation. And who's to say that Shakespeare didn't contribute to, or at least act in any of these 7 plays? In the absence of Shakespeare's manuscripts, none of which survive, as I mentioned earlier, there was and remains really no empirical evidence to contradict the third folio's claims. And you see the effect this had well into the 18th century, when Shakespeare's earliest editors began amending the plays to better fit what they believe Shakespeare actually wrote. The fourth folio, for its part, represents another turning point. And you can see that the 7 plays added to the third folio were again included in the fourth. And more than that the fourth folio uses the same marketing technique of claiming that these plays had never before appeared in folio, which of course we know is not true. The fourth folio is most significant, though, for being the last time that Shakespeare's plays would be printed in a single folio volume for nearly a century. It was really the kind of the last gasp of the folio form for Shakespeare. After 1685, when the fourth folio was printed, editions of Shakespeare were increasingly issued in multi-volume sets of a significantly smaller size. But even if it was the last of its kind, the publication of the fourth folio was a major cultural event. In the final decades of the 17th century, the fourth folio's publisher, a bookseller named Henry Herriman, had set out to print what were then considered the best English playwrights, each in their own folio volume. The other two folios were the works of Ben Jonson, which was published in 1692, and the comedies and tragedies of Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher, published in 1679. And both Jonson, Fletcher, and Beaumont were all contemporaries of Shakespeare. They all knew each other. They were competing. And you can see here that both title pages emphasize the fact that all of these authors' works were issued, usually for the first time, in one volume. And the language on the Jonson folio is really clear on this, right? It notes that Jonson's works, which were formerly printed in two volumes, are now reprinted in one. So there's this interest in consolidating, right? So you have one sort of easily shelved volume of all the works. Between these volumes, of course, is the fourth folio of Shakespeare's plays, printed in 1685. All three books are printed on large paper of an exceptional quality, reflecting their status as luxury objects. They are intended to be viewed and ultimately purchased as a set, a kind of physical representation of what were then, at the end of the 17th century, considered to be the classics of the English literary drama. With this in mind, the fourth folio brings us full circle, back to Milton's poem that appeared in the second folio. Here, Shakespeare was fully and finally part of a coherent vision of English culture, with his plays occupying a place of prominence and prestige. So the story of all four folios is therefore one of progression, right? That leads from the crowded theaters of early modern London to the shelves of the English aristocracy and the intelligentsia. That, in short, is why we have all four in one display, one gallery. One final reason for including all four of the folios in this exhibition is the stories about individual copies that we'd miss out on if we focused on the first folio alone. And as a scholar of the history of books, I'm drawn to particulars, right? These details of provenance that tell us something about how the lives of books have intersected with the lives of human beings over centuries. Often these stories are embedded in the materiality of the books themselves, telling us something about how a particular copy was used, abused, or revered at various points in its past. An obvious example of this might be annotations, right, made in the margin at a particular point in a play that an early reader found moving or worth remembering. And you see this a lot in surviving copies of the first folio. People were really not shy to write directly in their books. Unfortunately, I've found no evidence of this kind of readerly marking in any of the 7 Shakespeare folios at CMU, though that's not to say there never was any marking of the kind in our copies. Early annotations were not always viewed as desirable by collectors and were frequently erased or otherwise washed away. Under scrutiny, though, the Carnegie Mellon folios provide tantalizing evidence of their previous lives. The CMU first folio, for instance, conceals evidence of tampering. When its title page is placed over a light box, as you see here, a flaw is revealed in its paper. The outer margin has been lost and a new slip of paper grafted onto its ragged edge. And you can barely see the fault line separating the original leaf and this later edition on the slide. Hopefully that's clear, yeah. Meanwhile, the leaf with Ben Jonson's poem addressed to the reader that faces the title page is completely reframed in a new leaf. The darker material is of more recent origin, while the lighter central part is the original. And I'm always so impressed by this because you can see the faint sort of whitish lines that run vertically. Those are chain lines. It's just a feature of handmade paper. Whoever did this was careful enough to find a piece of paper that matched the original so that those chain lines would continue through the repair. That takes some doing. Okay, this next slide makes the graft on the title page a bit more visible. So you can see that it actually runs through Shakespeare's shoulder. There's that sort of whitish line in the image. It cuts diagonally close to the corner. As you can see though, there's no obvious break in the engraved portrait of Shakespeare. The hatching and woven patterns on his tunic continue across the graft, disguising the repair. Incredibly, this was done by hand, right? Someone with an immense amount of patience, skill, and probably a blank check from one of this copy's previous owners, imitated the original, filling in the damaged gap in a carefully hand-drawn facsimile. So everything to the right of that line is not printed, it's actually done by pen. And I'll point out that the first folio is displayed in the exhibition. It still has its title page open, so you can actually get a closer look at this in the gallery. I'm curious if any of you catch it on first glance. It actually took me 2 or 3 times looking at the first folio at CMU to realize like something was going on here. So it's really subtle. This is not uncommon though. Right? The early pages of first folios were often the most frequently handled, meaning they are often damaged or even torn away and lost. So well-heeled collectors, eager to own a pristine, complete copy, might overlook the dubious authenticity of a title page like this if it meant owning an apparently complete and fresh copy. But that's the first folio. What about the later folios, which, as I've claimed, are equally fascinating and offer up their own histories? One of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the CMU folios is this pair of inscribed names on the front flyleaf of one of our copies of the fourth folio. It's Margaret Brownlow and Alice Brownlow. Hopefully you can make that out. And you'll also see these signatures in the gallery. They're still on display. So unless books have well-documented provenance, inscriptions like this are more often than not anonymous marks made by unknown readers. These readers are not nameless, of course, but they are near to it. Their identities are too often lost to time. This particular copy provides additional clues, however, allowing us to fill in more of this copy's past. A book plate pasted inside the binding links it to Belton House, the Lincolnshire estate of the Brownlow family. Tracing the Brownlows' genealogy revealed a number of fascinating details about this pair of names. I'm relatively certain that Alice is the elder Alice Brownlow, wife of John Brownlow, who undertook a campaign of renovation at Belton House in the 1680s and funded the expansion of its library. The other name is a bit more difficult to pin down. It's obviously in a less even hand, suggesting that this was a child's attempt at writing her name. It appears that the writer began inscribing Alice in a style that imitates the other inscription, but changing her mind a few letters in, the writer instead spelled out her own name in full, Margaret Brownlow. So is this evidence of the elder Alice teaching her daughter Margaret to spell her name? The Shakespearean play title, Measure for Measure, that's written out below the 2 names, suggests that this might be the case. A less confident hand has attempted to copy out the title, giving up 3 letters in. You can see that there, M-E-A. And I really love this because it's almost as though they are taking the measure of their penmanship by writing out letter by letter every measure for measure. The second inscribed name might also be another daughter, Alice or Alicia, named for her mother, in which case this pair of names might record 2 sisters working together to mark their family's Shakespeare folio with their names. The evidence unfortunately permits only guesses and few certainties. Nevertheless, these inscriptions open a window onto the past and show us that Shakespeare folios functioned as objects of familial record-keeping. Amusingly, they also suggest that John Brownlow might have been this copy's first owner, but his daughters were its earliest and possibly only users. Incredibly, and I was so excited when I found this, a portrait that survives at Belton House, the Brownlows' one-time estate, shows Margaret Brownlow at 8 years old, allowing us to put a face to at least one of these haltingly inscribed names. And that portrait is shown on the right here. I want to end by touching briefly on the rarity of the folios, as well as the rarity of this occasion. Right? For one thing, centennial anniversaries, by definition, come around once only every 100 years. But more than that, I think we are all fortunate to be in Pittsburgh in the first folio's 400th year because of the exceptional quality of the Carnegie Mellon collection of Shakespeare Folios. The attention paid to the first folio, in this year in particular, can disguise the fact that these are rare books that are only rarely seen. 228 copies of the first folio survive, which actually makes it a comparatively common book. For example, the first standalone edition of Hamlet, a small pamphlet printed in 1603, 20 years before the first folio, survives in only 2 copies globally. The first folio is therefore something of a paradox. It is a rare book that is not particularly rare. What is rare, however, is the opportunity to see all 4 Shakespeare Folios in one room, or in this case, 7 folios, with the later 3 editions displayed in duplicate. Never before have any of the CMU folios been put on public display, let alone accompanied by the later folios. Oops. This trove of Shakespeare editions did not come to CMU by accident. Rather, it is the result of incredible acts of scholarship, connoisseurship, and philanthropy. Carnegie Mellon's copy of the first folio was gifted to the university in 1974 as a part of a major bequest by the Pittsburgh businessman and book collector Charles J. Rosenblum. The same bequest also included 1 copy each of the 3 later folios. CMU's second copies of the later folios came to the university shortly after this, when the Posner Memorial Collection was deposited with the university. Formed by Henry Posner Sr., the range and depth of the Posner Memorial Collection reflects Posner's determination to acquire the best copies of the best books. And I think it matters that all of the folios on display at the Frick were collected by Pittsburghers and left in bequest to a Pittsburgh university. And so while it's on display, I think we should all think of the CMU folio in these terms, right? While it might reside in special collections, it's very much Pittsburgh's folio. And with that in mind, I invite all of you, if you haven't already, to go and see the exhibition, take it in, and do feel free to reach out with any questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sam, for that extraordinary history of the folios. I'm going to share a little bit more about our partnership and our role. It's truly an honor for us to show these books. And when Sam first approached me about partnering to present this exhibition, it really seemed like a no-brainer. Shakespeare is England's poet, but his legacy has a huge presence in American culture, particularly during the Gilded Age. Performances of Shakespeare's plays were so ubiquitous throughout the late 18th and 19th century that many posited that Shakespeare might be more popular in America than he was in England. During his travels through the United States in the 1830s, Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville found Shakespeare in the recesses of the forests of the New World. He wrote, "There is hardly a pioneer's hut that does not contain a few odd volumes of Shakespeare." His observations were echoed 50 years later by a German writer who wrote that there is no other country on the face of this earth in which Shakespeare and the Bible are held in such general esteem as in America. And while the popularity of Shakespeare has waxed and waned over the centuries, it truly grew to cult status in the 19th century. And the Frick family was among the playwright's many fans. I knew of several Shakespeare-related objects in our collection, but as we dug deeper into our database, we found so many more. So I'm going to share some of those highlights with you, and you can see several on view in the exhibition as well. So while Henry Clay Frick was not a book collector, in fact, it turned out that he had purchased his own version of a folio in 1880. This is not as rare as the 17th century folios. This was printed in 1879, but it is a really large, heavy, impressive tome. It has beautiful adornment, stamped leather binding with intricate borders, gilded lettering, and an ornate script. And this was one of the Avon edition, which sounds very distinguished, of the complete dramatic and poetical works of William Shakespeare from a Philadelphia publisher. The volume includes all of the latest revisions of the best Shakespearean scholars, an updated author biography, plot summaries, a character index, a guide to familiar passages, and a glossary, all very valuable resources for anyone who is looking to show off their knowledge of the literary figure. Familiarity with Shakespeare was an important demonstration of one's intellect and taste in the 19th century. And Henry Clay Frick, who inscribed the front page with his name and purchase date, likely deemed it a very necessary form of cultural capital as he began to climb the social ladder as a newly minted millionaire industrialist in the early 1880s. And there's more details that are just really fun. The layout of the book follows the same 2-column layout that you see in the 17th century folios. It's a great space saver and hopefully was easier to set in 1879 than it had been in 1623. We have our very familiar image of Shakespeare, although he's looking decidedly Instagram filtered. And really beautiful marbled end papers. So another detail that made this Avon edition desirable to discerning customers. Also in the library at Clayton is a biography of Shakespeare written in 1800, histories of Elizabethan England, and a collection of rare prints. This limited connoisseur edition, everything is very, limited, special, connoisseur, distinguished, which eBay will tell you that this might not be quite as rare as it purports to be, includes 12 folders containing 146 loose prints that offer a varied look at Shakespeare's work and world. There are portraits of the playwright, again, that familiar engraving with a new adaptation. Images of actors and actresses, there's portraits, but there are also images of them performing, and artistic interpretations of famous scenes. This mix between the historical and fictional imagery really blurs the lines between reality and art in a way that reflects the texts themselves and Shakespeare's larger-than-life reputation. And you'll see a selection of these in the front hallway case in the front of the museum. Several of the books in our collection have inscriptions and markings on the inner pages that hint at those lives lived. As Sam said, the intersection between a book and a human being. Several were gifts, as this inscription shows. One of our 2 copies of Tales from Shakespeare was a gift to Helen Clay Frick on her 12th birthday from her dear friend Elizabeth Holmes. I don't know many 12-year-olds who exchange volumes of Shakespeare as birthday gifts these days, but this was a really, really charming inscription to find. There are also several pocket-sized versions that were used by Childs and Helen Clay Frick in their studies. Just like we have read Shakespeare in high school English, so were they. And a few of these include notes and assignments, underlined passages, and sometimes even some doodles and drawings. This copy of Macbeth is perhaps the most marked up example that we have. Includes a note from Childs Frick on the title page there, saying that he is in seat 220 during sixth form, which is equivalent to 11th or 12th grade, at Shadyside Academy, that is the SSA. So you can also see he has some notes tucked inside on the tragic form with the introduction, rising action, falling action, and catastrophe. He has scribbled his name on the end papers of the book there, and there's even a little sketch of a face that's quite well done in the back of the book. There are also several volumes of Shakespeare adapted for children in our collection, and my absolute favorite is this charming illustrated copy of The Taming of the Shrew from the Little Folks Shakespeare series published in 1883. It has the most beautiful lithographed illustrations. It's a really charming retelling of the story, and I can imagine Martha or Childs or Helen reading this as a young kid and getting the gist in 20 pages with some great pictures. One of the most stunning volumes in the Library at Clayton, Shakespeare-related and non, is this 1908 copy of A Midsummer Night's Dream, illustrated by Arthur Rackham, who was a celebrated British artist. He is really well known. His work is noted for these robust pen and ink drawings, which were combined with the use of watercolor, which was a technique that he had developed during his background as a journalistic illustrator. His Shakespearean fairies exemplify the dreamlike romantic style for which he was known, and which really formed the visual vocabulary of the Art Nouveau. And I add two more here because I love these so much, and we can only show the book open to one page in the exhibition. So I'll include a few more illustrations here. They're so lush, and I get a little lost in them. They're fantastic. Do you know how once you start looking for something, you see it absolutely everywhere? So we were looking for Shakespeare, we're looking for more things, and that just continued happening. I was looking through historic photos of Clayton, the historic home of the Frick family that's at the opposite end of our campus, looking for something else entirely. I can't even remember what I was looking for, when my eyes lit on a really tiny detail above Frick's desk in the sitting room that I had never noticed before. It is a sweet little box marked Shakespeare, and I'll note the romanticized historic spelling, with taking some liberties with vowel placement or lack of vowels as well. So this little box was probably a gift set, something like the one that you see here, really handy palm-sized versions of the plays. Unfortunately, this does not exist in our collection, but perhaps it will turn up someday. So we have a visual clue. If anyone ever sees anything like this, you know who to come to. But the box wasn't the only thing in the photo. There's one more detail in the lower left corner. Does anyone see something that looks familiar from a couple of slides ago? It's our bound collection of prints. It was so fun to discover this in the photo and see how the Frick family was living with these books. The photos from 1901 are likely taken around January, just after Christmas. You can see the holiday decorations in other rooms of the house. So it's quite possible that the Shakespeare boxed gift set or this print collection were Christmas gifts or holiday gifts given within the family. And it just really drives home the idea that these books, as Sam was saying, they are cultural vessels holding memories of people and how they are being used. So it's not just the books themselves that are special, but how they were consumed, gifted, and read. And we love getting these glimpses into everyday life at Clayton. It was really fun to dive specifically into Shakespeare-related life at Clayton. So the Frick family's interest in Shakespeare and the continued popularity of his words is traced back to the creation of the first folio. Pittsburgh is lucky to have these cultural treasures, and it is truly an honor for us to partner with CMU to show them in our galleries. So thank you all for coming out and for being here. I'm sure we have a little bit of time if anybody has questions, or Sam and I will stick around if you want to chat with us in the galleries. Thank you.